everyone. We're your moderators today for this great webinar with Yassamin Ansari. And before we start, we're just going to introduce ourselves. So my name is Kami. I am originally from Austria, but currently at Harvard. And my project is focused on SDG 13, and I'm working on creating a decision support system for managing the climate crisis.
Hi everyone, my name is Mont Valdez. I'm from Mexico, and I'll be your co-moderator today.
And as we're now sort of going to get started, so there are participants trickling in, but we'd sort of love to welcome you, the Millennium Fellows, to our Millennium Fellowship webinar session. And for the next sort of 45 to 50 minutes, we will first have our moderated dialogue where we will be asking for around 15 minutes questions with Yassamin Ansari. And then for the remaining 30 minutes, we will open up Q&A so you can ask your own questions. And the way that this is going to work is we're going to be unmuting you when we ask for you to ask a question. And please continue to type your introductions and also questions to Yassamin in the chat box.
Please type your name, university, and country, and introduce yourself in the chat box.
So to start off today's talk, we would like to introduce Yassamin Ansari.
Yassamin Ansari is a climate activist currently running for City Council in Phoenix, Arizona. She serves as an advisor to the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, where she spent the last years spearheading youth engagement and public mobilization for the 2019 UN Climate Action Summit. She is also a principal advisor at Mission 2020, a global climate action campaign convened by former UN Climate Chief Cristina Figueres. For her extensive work on climate change, Yassamin was recently recognized as Risk 50 Fixers, the people cooking up the boldest, most innovative solutions to fix the biggest challenges that face our globe.
Yassamin began her career as a John Gardner Fellow in the Executive Office of the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, where she served as the youngest member of the climate team that advised the Secretary General and helped to deliver the historic Paris Agreement. Later, she also served as the director of the Climate Action 2016 Summit in Washington, D.C. Yassamin later also worked with the Office of Governor Jerry Brown, where she served as the Deputy Director of Policy for the Global Climate Action Summit, a historic event that delivered more than 500 new commitments from business, cities, states, and regions to tackle climate change.
Yassamin holds a bachelor's degree in international relations with honors from Stanford University and a master's degree from the University of Cambridge. At Stanford, she interned for Congressman Nancy Pelosi, led an international campaign to educate college students about the global refugee crisis through Syria Deeply, and was selected as a national finalist for the Harry Truman Scholarship. Yassamin has received many awards and accolades for her work, including the John Gardner Public Service Fellowship, the Stanford Award of Excellence, and the U.S. Department of State Critical Language Scholarship, among others.
Welcome, Yassamin, and it's a pleasure to have you today.
Hi, thank you so much. Sorry, that was, I didn't realize you would read that bio. It was very long, but great to be with you guys.
Great to have you today, Yassamin. So I thought we'd sort of start off with how you got started with getting involved in climate action. And in preparation for this interview, I read that working on the climate crisis wasn't actually something on your mind initially, and really just a passion that you developed when you started working at the UN. And I'd really be interested to know what about working at the UN made you focus on the climate crisis.
Sure. So I can tell you guys a little bit about the story of how I got here. So I started working at the UN around 5 years ago. So originally during undergrad, I went to Stanford and I was studying international relations, and I was really interested in US foreign policy in the Middle East. My own parents are from Iran, so I grew up speaking Farsi, and politics were always a really big part of our lives and our conversations. So I spent my undergrad years studying Arabic and living in the Middle East, and really wanted to work, I don't know, like at the State Department or in some sort of like policy making realm focused on Iran or the Middle East more broadly. But I was really lucky. I won this fellowship when I graduated from undergrad. And the idea of the fellowship is that they pay for you for 10 months to work in public service, but it can be really anything. So I started interviewing around, and the person who, one of the people who I spoke with was this individual named Dr. Robert Orr. And at the time, he was the Assistant Secretary General for Strategic Planning here in the Executive Office of the Secretary General for Ban Ki-moon. That meant he covered everything from climate change to sustainable development to he even covered counterterrorism. But through speaking with him, at the time they were preparing for the first Secretary General Climate Summit in 2014. And he really was the one who, when I spoke to him, he's like, you know, you're really interested in national security. You've worked on refugee issues. Climate change is, you know, this threat multiplier that will exacerbate all of these problems. And you really, if you want to work on those issues, you need to be working on climate change. And that's very obvious now. And that's something that, you know, if I think is a really like well understood concept now. But 5 years ago, I think climate was a bit more like, you know, we all knew it was not a good thing. Climate change is bad, but we didn't really understand it as deeply as we do now. But I was really compelled by the way he presented it. So I came here to work for him. And just, you know, it was the lead up to the Paris Agreement. It was about a year and a half before the Paris Agreement was adopted in December 2015. And it was just so great to be able to work with a team of people from all over the world, so passionate about getting this global agreement adopted, which truly was historic. To say that, you know, nearly every country in the world, you know, it took 20 some years to get nearly every country in the world to agree to this accord that kind of lays out the blueprint of how we need to decarbonize and get eventually to a net zero world. So it was a steep learning curve for sure. I really didn't know much when I started, but I learned a lot about the political dynamics and what it takes in terms of like what each country and each region really cares about. You know, how important it is for developing countries to know that developed countries reduce their emissions and provide them with resources and financing to be able to adapt. There's a lot of different dynamics at play, but then essentially I've worked on climate change since then. I stayed through after the Paris Agreement was adopted, and then I worked on a climate summit in Washington, D.C. That aim to kind of keep that momentum going. And then, you know, I've been, you read the bio, but essentially I think climate is obviously the most pressing issue of our time. It touches on everything. It's a really all-encompassing issue. And that's the reason why I'm also running for city council, is because, you know, I think it's really important for local leaders to understand the urgency of the crisis and be able to take the actions that we need at all levels. Because even if we have this great agreement and we have targets at the international level, you really need people at all levels of government, within companies, within schools. Like, we need to stop using carbon and we need to be working towards a more sustainable world.
Yeah, I love the fact that you said that sort of climate change, the reason why you started working on climate change is because the realization that it touches on every single issue of our time. And I think that's a really important message. I think it maybe seems obvious to some of us now, but I think there are still a lot of people out there who don't realize that, who are like, well, you know, there are so many other issues to work on. Why is climate change the only issue we should work on? And I think you put it very well, saying that it is not just the issue of our time, but it is the issue of our time that affects every part of our globe. So yeah, thank you very much for that great insight. I think that should hopefully inspire a lot of people who are also working on other issues to think about how their work could be integrated in
Talking about the Paris Agreement and the work of the UN with respect to climate change, in an interview with Women in Foreign Policies, you mentioned that the levels of bureaucracy in the UN are high, which means things can often take much longer than expected or desired. This creates a dilemma in the face of the climate crisis, which presents us with an imminent external deadline. If you could make a decision, how would you help the UN adapt to this challenge? How do you see the role of the UN in the climate crisis changing the face of this dilemma?
It's a good question that I don't think I necessarily have the answer to fixing the UN. But look, I think one of the most valuable roles that the UN can play in climate is by using its influence and convening power to bring people together around this issue. And in particular, the Secretary General can play that role very well. So this past year, for example, we were gearing up the entire year, actually starting 2 years ago, for the climate summit that took place this past September. And the Secretary General, was always out there. This current Secretary General has been extremely bold when it comes to his own talking points and what he's asking of world leaders to do. And he consistently was going out and saying, we cannot be building any new coal plants after 2020. Coal should not be in the picture after 2020. We need to stop subsidizing fossil fuels. These sorts of calls, like these very specific types of actions, I would say is something that is very important for somebody at that level to be calling for, because even if it's not answered immediately, you're setting the bar high and you're saying that, world leaders should be aspiring to this if we want to have any chance of reaching a net zero world by 2050, and even before that, having global emissions by 2030. So I think, the UN can be very bureaucratic. There's a lot of different agencies doing really good work. The UN Development Program, has offices in almost every country in the world. They're doing the on-the-ground stuff. And then you have UN headquarters here with, again, a lot of different things. But it's really, I think, the most powerful role that we can play, in addition to the on-the-ground work, again, is this convening power of the Secretary General. There's really nobody else in the world, barring a few presidents out there, who have the power to bring as many heads of state together as the Secretary General does. And, I think the climate summit this year, it was meant to be a launching pad for 2020. I don't know how much everyone on the call knows about the Paris Agreement, but every 5 years, governments are supposed to come back to the table and say, we're going to enhance our national plans so that we actually meet the targets and don't exceed the 1.5 degrees warming above pre-industrial levels. And it was really important to have this summit this year because we had a couple countries come forward and say, okay, we're ready. We will be committing to new national targets by the end of 2020. So you have, you start the process, you start this, like, you have the leaders out there, and then hopefully you have others follow. And that's really something that only the UN Secretary General has the convening power to bring people together like that and inspire that kind of action.
Yeah, well, thank you for sort of illustrating what the role of the UN, what do you think the role of the UN is in crisis? Because I think it's helpful also for people on the call, for all our guests here, to understand some parts of how the UN is working. They might not understand all of that or be aware. And on that note, just briefly, so people are sort of aware, could you, because you mentioned the Paris Agreement and the fact that every 5 years they're renewing their pledges, you sort of shaped and take a part of organizing also the Youth Climate Action Summit that was held in New York City. And it seems like you have quite some understanding of what was happening in general at the General Secretary's Climate Action Summit. Could you comment on, it's 2020 in like a month and a few days. Where are we at? I personally know, if you look at Climate Action Tracker, we're still on the course for like 4 degrees of warming. But I'd love for you to sort of bring everyone else on the webinar up to speed so we can also have a deeper conversation about it.
Yeah, so delving a bit more, so essentially the way the Paris Agreement was designed purposefully was that they're called ratchet cycles. So so in 2015, when all the countries said, okay, we're going to adopt this agreement, they also put forward something called nationally determined contributions, which the acronym is NDCs. So that's like a very common acronym in the climate world. People will refer to NDCs, and what they're really referring to is countries' domestic plans, right? So the idea is that you have this agreement, and then every single country will, based on their own circumstances and their own technology and their own financing, whatever the circumstances are in their own country, they will put together their own national climate plans, and hopefully collectively that will all add up to where to the ambitions that we need at that larger level. Now, if you look at the climate plans that were put forward in 2015, they put us nowhere on track to 1.5. And the situation would be disastrous. But that's why the 5-year cycle was designed, so that every 5 years, based on whether it's new technologies that come out that we don't know about yet, based on financial resources, just based on like the situation in the world changing, each country needs to come back to the table with enhanced climate plans every 5 years. So the end of 2020, we've reached that 5-year point, and it's time for that. So that was the entire purpose of the Secretary General Summit this year, and say that they will have enhanced plans by next year. I think, the reality is we're in a really difficult political situation, to put it mildly. Obviously, you have the U.S. I'm American. It's really upsetting, the situation that we have in the U.S. with the Trump administration withdrawing from the agreement. I think 2020 presidential election in the U.S., frankly, is going to be important to the entire world. I would say it's like the climate election. If we don't elect a Democrat president, it's really going to be disastrous for even the Paris Agreement and like whether or not that whole thing stays alive. But yeah, I mean, it's a difficult political situation. You also have Brazil, et cetera. But that's why, I think the Secretary General will continue to push on countries to come forward with their enhanced plans next year, push on countries to not create any new coal plants after 2020, stop subsidizing fossil fuels, all of these things. You mentioned the youth summit, so I can talk a bit about that too. Obviously, we had this incredible momentum this past year, thanks to Greta Thunberg kicking off the climate strikes, but then it becoming such a global movement everywhere. I would say that has been one of the most helpful things in general in terms of like pushing leaders to do more and like just making climate. I feel like, the average person talks about climate change so much more now because of all of the strikes and it becoming more of a thing on the news. So we thought a lot about, myself and my colleague here, who's in the other room, we're leading the youth engagement track. And so we decided to have a youth climate summit because we really wanted to provide young people with a platform at the UN where they could, go from like kind of the on the streets action to a platform where they could showcase their solutions. We obviously have a lot of young people around the world who are leading energy companies, who are, compelling activists, they're storytellers, they're artists, they're doing so many different amazing things on climate. So it was really cool. We brought together around 1,000 young people from around the world. We funded a lot of young people to be able to come to New York. We had a town hall where, oftentimes at the UN where you have events, things are very filtered. Like if there's going to be a president in the room, the president usually knows in advance what questions they're going to be asked. There's briefing notes prepared. It's all kind of rehearsed in a way. But we were able to have this town hall where the youth who participated were able to ask direct, unfiltered questions to presidents. The governor of Washington was there. We had some ministers there. So yeah, I think it was really great. There's always things that can be improved, but I really hope that young people can be included in a more systematic way on all climate related things moving forward. It's super important. And have more of an opportunity to engage directly with decision makers, because at the end of the day, the activism is fantastic, but like decision makers need to be, young people need to be at the decision making table, basically, to be able to help develop the policies that we need to see in every country.
Yeah, for sure. Just a quick announcement to all the fellows. We're getting towards the end of the moderated section, so please do write any questions that you have in the chat box, and we will then field those questions to Yassamin or unmute you so you can field them. So while we are going into sort of the last question of the moderated section, please write them in the chat box, as many as you have. So yeah.
So last question from us. For those on this webinar who are interested in working at the UN at an early age, what advice would you give to them? What insights, best practices, and skills help you get where you are right now?
Great question. I definitely get that a lot. And it's really tough because frankly, it's actually really hard to get a job at the UN. And I always admit I was really lucky that I got to come work here through the fellowship that I received, because usually when you just apply straight up, like, you know, if you just go through the application process at the UN, one, you typically always have to have a master's degree to be able to get a job here. We've had PhD students in our office who are interns, who are like, it's messed up. Like I'm just saying this to say that it's like a really messed up situation. I would advise, there's beyond like the typical staff positions where you apply and it can often take a year to even hear back or go through the interview process. There's a lot of consultancies, and it's becoming more common for people to be hired as consultants to the UN as opposed to like a full-time. You're still full-time, but if you go through the staff process, there's just like, it's a very bureaucratic process. But UN Development Program, for example, UN Women, UNICEF, all of these agencies, if you look on their websites in particular, in the job openings, you'll also see consultancies. And they can often be shorter term, 6 months, 9 months, etc. But it's a really, really good way to get your foot in the door. And oftentimes at the UN, that's all it is. Like, you want to get your foot in the door, you want people to know you, and then they'll hire you. Like, that's exactly what happened to me. I got to come here through my fellowship. First 10 months, I was paid by my fellowship, a stipend. So the UN wasn't paying me anything, you know? So it was kind of, it was good for them. They were getting resource for free. But then I got to know the team, and I did well, and I performed, and then I was hired as a consultant full time. So it's just like, those relationships are so important. So check out consultancies, check out JPO programs, like depending on what, that means junior professional officer. For a lot of, depending on what country you're from, and where you are, there's like junior professional programs where you can apply and you get like a 2-year appointment in a certain office. A lot of developed countries fund JPOs for developing country applicants. So that's kind of cool. And yeah, I mean, if there's any sort of like, again, relationships are so important. If there's any, if you ever have like programs at your universities where like people from the UN come to speak, or if you like can reach out to people and get coffees, it's always just useful to have, try to build relationships with people who work there and get their advice and whatnot, because it can be so tricky to navigate and can be so difficult. And it's really unfortunate that even the internships are still unpaid. And I'm sure people saw there a couple of years ago, there was a lot of like outrage about that. But nothing happened. They're still unpaid.
Okay. Well, yeah. Thank you very much for sort of providing advice, even though it seems still pretty tough to get in.
Yeah,
I think,
trying to be realistic and
no,
honest with
sure.
you guys.
I think also I think it's important to note that there are so many things in this world that are hard to get into.
Yeah.
It's hard to get into a good university. It's
Yeah.
hard to, even to finish well in school. So I think it shouldn't be a deterrent. I think people who are on this webinar, who are interested in working at the UN or somehow doing something at the UN, I think this should just make you more determined to try. So we're getting towards the end of our moderated section, and we have a question from Mohammed Al-Tiar, and we will unmute you, and then you can ask your question to Yassamin.
Hi, everybody. My name is Muhammad Al-Tayyar from Al-Raz University, Yemen. It is known in developing countries they are disposing of tons of trash by burning. This causes carbon dioxide. What is the best way to dispose of trash instead of burning, especially in the developing countries? Thank you.
Sorry, I think my internet connection dropped out a bit. Do you mind repeating the question?
Okay. It is known in developing countries they are disposing of tons of trash by burning. This causes carbon dioxide. What is the best way to dispose of trash instead of burning, especially in developing countries? Thank you.
I see. Okay. Sorry?
Is it clear now, or do you want me to summarize?
You can summarize, but I think I got it.
Okay.
So, I mean, that's a really good question, and I'm going to be completely honest. I'm not like a technical expert on these sorts of things. I mean, you're right. Burning trash is not a good solution at all. It's in fact extremely dangerous also for health, and the toxic chemicals that come from that are really, really, really dangerous. I guess, I mean, the solutions that I've always heard instead of burning, the one thing you hear is it's very important to develop local services for recycling and garbage disposal in countries. And I don't know, I'm not sure what the solution is. I would actually ask you, does such a thing exist where you are? Or is the only thing that people are doing is burning?
Excuse me. Repeat the question, please.
I was asking if you know of any local services for recycling or garbage disposal in your country.
No. In my countries, there is no recycled garbage. There is no factory for that. Just only burn. That's the only solution for that.
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially, from what I understand and like everything I've worked on, that's really the solution, is to develop local services for recycling and garbage disposal, which could be something you take up, for example, if that was something you were passionate about, because you're right, it's absolutely, it's really dangerous to the health of the citizens in your country to be burning that. I just wonder how you go about doing that. But if I were you, that's something that I would explore developing or trying to start up, if possible, is a local recycling service so that you can do everything within your own country.
Yeah, thank you, Mohammed, for your great question. I think something you should look into is carbon capture and storage right at the source. So you might still be burning trash, but the carbon is immediately captured when it's released. So that's one way. There are also several strange things happening with bacteria that actually can degrade plastic pretty easily. So just suggestions from my side maybe to look into. But thanks so much for your question, and thank you, Yasmin, for your answer. We have another question coming in.
From Zamala Oladipupo. We're gonna unmute you so you can ask your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, my question is, the climate debate seems to be more prominent in the West, especially considering high media coverage. While I can say the less is obtainable in developing countries like Nigeria, is there something to be worried about, especially considering the fact that, like you said, the US pulled out of the agreement? Is there something to be worried about?
Do you mean, is there something to be worried about that you're not seeing as much media coverage in developing countries?
Developing country, the conversation seems to be, less exactly. What was obtainable in the West, where everybody keeps talking about it and all of that. So I don't know. There seems to be more of debate. Debate seems to be more prominent in West than developing countries here like Nigeria. So is there something to be worried about?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I've heard that before from a lot of the climate activists who are really active in the global south, especially in Africa. There's a few, like there's a woman in Uganda named Vanessa Nakate, and she's like one of the only climate strikers in Uganda, and she's always tweeting about, you know, how she's not getting any, you know, when you look at her, she's doing the same thing as like a Greta, but she's not getting, you know, any attention, and she's by herself and all of that. I mean, it's hard. On one hand, like the problem is mostly with the developed world, and that's who needs to be feeling the urgency to actually take really serious action. So on one hand, you know, my perspective is it's good that finally, I don't even think we're seeing as much media coverage in the US as we should. We're getting more than we ever have. But, you know, I think it's really important for developed countries to realize that we are the problem, and, you know, and people need to wake up to that and take action. But I think, you know, if you're concerned and you want to see more coverage in your own country, I think it's really up to you and like really get it, you know, organizing in your community and making it a big thing. I think the only reason things get coverage is when there's like something more to cover, if that makes sense. So obviously, like when in Europe you're seeing mass protests, there's going to be more coverage about that. So I don't know. I mean, this is a really interesting conversation for debate of like how you go about doing that. I mean, you could start by potentially, I don't know if this works where you are in Nigeria, but like here, what people always suggest is like writing to your local newspaper, reaching out to the media yourself, writing op-eds that could be published, you know, being more active yourself and actually reaching out to reporters or journalists or to your any local media that you have, the radio, you know, if you could reach out and try to get on the radio and talk about climate change. Like, I think it takes citizen pressure also sometimes on media to make an issue more urgent. So it could be something interesting for you to think about. I actually know I worked with a woman from Nigeria here. Her name's Esther, and she's like been super active on climate change her whole life. And I know she knows a lot of people in Nigeria. So who are working on this. So you might already be very well connected to these people, but if not, I'd be happy to connect you, and maybe it's something that you guys could brainstorm about.
Great. Thank you so much. Just when we call on you, please introduce yourself again, just with your name and where you're from. And yeah, we have another question from, I'm very sorry if I mispronounced this name, but Ayarchana Darira. We will unmute you and ask your question.
Hi, so I'm Sayarchana. I'm from Arizona State University, and I actually heard you speak at the UNICEF conference at ASU, so it was super inspiring. I don't know if you remember me. I think we met briefly.
So funny.
Sorry, what did you say? You broke up.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, but
I just thought that's so funny.
yeah, but it's so nice seeing you again. So I had more of a practical question, like a professional question actually. So obviously these jobs like working for the UN, even like applying to be in the city council, all of them are very competitive. And I've always like struggled with like being confident in applying to these very prestigious positions myself, or like thinking about doing that one day because of how competitive it is and how qualified a lot of people are in applying for these positions. So what advice would you give to people who are interested in doing positions like what you're doing right now one day when it's so competitive and there's so many qualified people who are applying for it?
I mean, to be completely honest, like my advice always is to just apply to everything. Like there's literally nothing bad that can come of you applying. And like, I'm someone who from when I was really young, like I would just, even when I already had like too much on my plate, I would continue to apply to anything that seemed interesting to me. And it's just like, it's really good practice. And like the more you do these applications, whether it's essays or interview practice, like you're just going to get better and better. And also at the same time, like the worst that's going to happen, the worst thing that's going to happen is you're going to be in the exact same position that you currently are. So there's like no reason, I think, like my advice to you would just be like, who cares how competitive something is? Like, who cares if the chances are 0.001%? Like, you will become a better person simply for going through the process of applying to something, especially because a lot of like, whether it's like a fellowship or an internship, a lot of these applications these days like really make you think critically about yourself. And there's like very interesting essay questions, and there's, you know, in interviews, you're always practicing your public speaking, and like you will become much stronger and a much stronger candidate every time you apply to something. So yeah, I mean, I just like, don't be scared. There's nothing you are just as qualified as anybody else. And frankly, I mean, I know there's like statistics around just comparing men and women in this regard too. Like apparently when you're a man, like when you read the description of a job and like the requirements that are there, men often like see one thing that they have and they're like, okay, great. And they apply, but women often don't apply because they don't have every single thing on that list. And like, we cut ourselves out of so many different opportunities because we think like, oh, you know, it says 7 years experience and I only have 5 years. Like there's no way. But like, honestly, there's probably a really good chance like you could still get something, even if nobody has everything that's listed. So yeah, just trust yourself. Like you are super qualified, you're talented, you bring value to things, and just go out there and apply to everything that seems interesting to you.
Great. We just saw that Sahiti has a question. And please, again, introduce yourself and we'll unmute you.
Awesome. I feel like, yeah, you guys can hear me and see me, right?
Oh, good.
Awesome. Okay. Hi. My name is Sahiti Maduri, and I'm the campus director from UNC Charlotte. And I have a question for you. So just last month, a campaign was launched by the YouTube community to plant 20 million trees. Do you think initiatives like this can help move the needle towards combating climate change?
Do you mean like initiatives around trees or initiatives that are more like creatively produced?
So there was this YouTuber who made this goal of planting 20 million trees, and he like challenged other YouTube communities, and like he's making this whole entire campaign online virtually, but they're actually going out there and planting trees and creating blogs about it. So do you think that that kind of pushes towards better climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I think I did see that. I was trying to clarify the question, but I think it's awesome. I mean, I think the entire climate issue, like what's really important is that we get everyone involved in some way, shape, or form. And it becomes something that like every human on this planet realizes like this affects me and this is critical and I need to take action in some way, shape, or form. So my personal opinion is that I think it's really cool that a YouTuber would, you know, come up with a creative campaign like that, and that probably engages a whole new audience. And the UN tried to engage, we wouldn't be able to engage. So it's getting celebrities, influencers, YouTubers, like that's something like a constant conversation we have at the UN and with my team at Mission 2020 is how do we go beyond the climate bubble is what we call it, which is just like the usual community of people at NGOs or in government or whatnot that already work on this issue. How do we go beyond that? How do we touch the average person? And some really cool things that we've done in the past is actually bring random YouTube influencers to climate summits, and they like produce content out of the event, and you know that's reaching an audience we'd never be able to reach. Gotcha. So short answer is yes, I think it's great.
I have a follow-up question for, I just thought about it. So before you mentioned something like the president or the government officials, their questions are like, they know the questions beforehand. It's a little bit rehearsed. So the inside of me, I'm just like, I have a fire. I'm like, I don't want to see that. So what is some advice that you would give young people, young students like us who can like go to these events and ask those daring questions? Is that even possible? Can we actually go and speak up and hold them accountable if nothing is being done at the leadership level and the country level?
I think so. I mean, in every country, I mean, no, that statement was about to be very ignorant. In some countries, there are public forums in which, you know, you can go and speak with your elected officials. I mean, you're in the US. I'm sure members of Congress or members of the city council or members of the state house in North Carolina hold town halls that you could go to and ask whatever you want. I mean, it just depends on, I was referring to the UN, in which, like, usually when we have some sort of high level event, things are pretty rehearsed. But in like a public type of town hall that an elected official has, at least in the United States, they're not going to know what questions come their way. So I actually think that would be really effective. Like, I've been working with some climate activists in Arizona, and they haven't actually really done this yet, but we've been talking about, you know, we need to be going to the town halls that city council members have, or, you know, our representatives have, and we need to constantly be bringing up the climate issue over and over and over again until, because, you know, if elected officials don't hear from their constituents, whether it's on the phone, by letter, email, or at these events, then they're not going to prioritize your issue. That's just how it is. They want to prioritize issues that they think is going to get them elected again, which is like whatever their constituents bring up. So yeah, if I were you, I would go to these sorts of events and like be bold, be daring, ask whatever you want, and make sure they hear from you in terms of the issues that are most important to you.
Gotcha. Right. Thank you.
Well, these are some great conversations about sort of YouTubers and influencers, and also how actually the climate crisis is being spoken about. But there's another question.
There's another question from Dana. We're going to meet you, Dana Sundar.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Dhanasundar. I'm from K.S. Rangson College of Technology from India. My question is about forest contributes more in counteracting the climate changes happening now. But in recent incidents, like in Amazon forest fires, there have been conspiracy theories the government is purposefully removing the forest area for development purposes. I want to know how UN is planning to prevent these kind of events, protecting forest regions from governments.
That's a good question. I mean, it's a very complicated issue for sure, just given that, you know, the UN can really only, you know, condemn things, speak on what's wrong, what's not, you know, what's okay, what's not, but we can't really stop a government from doing whatever it wants to do in its own country. The UN just doesn't have that kind of power. With the Amazon fire specifically, you know, I think the UN as an institution and all of the most senior leadership spoke very, very clearly on how it was, you know, extraordinarily concerning. There's like a chief of biodiversity within the UN. Her name is Christiana Palmar, if I remember correctly. I mean, she spoke very, very clearly on this. Her mandate is to protect nature and forests, and there's a whole biodiversity conference that's happening next year on that. And similarly, the UN Secretary General was very, very clear on that. It's a topic that came up quite a bit at the summit as well. But in terms of preventing it from happening further, I mean, truly, like, the most that the UN can do is just like try to speak with the presidencies of these countries, tell that, you know, highly encourage them not to do this, speak about it openly, but there's really, you know, not much else. But I will say the UN is prioritizing, I think nature-based solutions in general has become a big topic in recent years. I mean, we spoke about trees a little bit earlier with the YouTube discussion, but I think people are really quickly realizing that even to reach that 1.5 degree target, we can't just reduce our emissions. We also have to radically restore nature at the same time. And so, you know, it's good to see there is actually a lot of momentum in terms of commitments that are being made around reforestation, around planting trees, et cetera, because nature-based solutions are such a big part of addressing the climate crisis. And it's a solution that we have, and it's not something that still needs to be developed with technology. So yeah, that, I mean, two-part answer to your question, I would say that the UN has condemned what's happening in Brazil and then also really prioritizing nature-based solutions as a solution.
Well, thank you, Yasmin, for fielding that sort of tough question, I guess. I have another tough question, and I'll give a little bit of context for everyone on the webinar. So the climate crisis can be seen sort of as the product of a contradiction, which is that our economic system demands infinite economic growth on a finite planet. And for those who aren't like familiar with this or aware, this is because all of our banks lend on average $10 for every dollar that they actually have in reserve, which means to make up for this debt and not tumble into a financial crisis, our economy must double every 20 years, which essentially means that solving the climate crisis entails changing the foundation on which almost our entire global society is built. And I've been struggling with this dilemma, and I just wanted to hear sort of how have you thought about addressing this fundamental challenge, or what are some of your thoughts about this dilemma, given that it's not like with CFCs where you can just kind of replace one thing?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the way the Green New Deal is being pushed in the US is a perfect example of what you're referring to. I mean, the reality is that in order to address climate change, we really have to change everything. And that really scares people because change can be really scary to people. But at the end of the day, our current economic system where everything is about profit isn't working. And it's the reason we are where we are today. If we didn't have a system where oil executives only care about their own profit and becoming the wealthiest people on this planet, then we wouldn't have the crisis that we have today. And that just needs to change. We need to change the way we live. We need to change our transportation systems. We need to change the way our buildings are designed and built. We need to develop technology that allows us to fly or not fly, whatever, without, emitting carbon. Everything has to change. And I think the economic piece is critical to that. I mean, the insurance industry said years ago that on the current trajectory we're on, they won't even be able to insure people anymore because disasters will just be happening so frequently. And a lot of heads of big financial institutions, Mark Carney in the UK, the head of BlackRock here in the US, they've all made very clear statements about climate change being a huge threat to our economy. And that just means things have to change. And I think the hardest part about it is just like, how do you change people's mindsets? I think in the US, I can only really comfortably speak to the political situation in the US, but the concept of changing everything just like freaks people out so much. But the way we're currently living and the way our society is designed is what's, driving us straight towards catastrophe. And I think something that, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez always says that resonates with me really strongly is like, when you talk about the cost of acting on climate change, look at the cost of inaction. That will cost us trillions, probably, whatever's more than trillions, like the cost will be insane. It's, you have to invest in changing things now and preventing the worst of it. Otherwise, it's just a complete disaster.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, it's a tough question, but I think your answer is hopefully helpful for people to also think about this on their own. So we're sort of getting towards the end of this webinar, and it's sort of a wrap for the questions.
I think it was really helpful to hear about what drives you to pursue this work and how you came to this realization. I think something we can all take away from this webinar is that climate change influences the problem and crisis of the planet, and the solutions will have to be multifaceted. It was great to hear about your work with UN. Thank you so much, and I hope that the fellows on this webinar have become even more invigorated to fight this fight of our life and also have better insights on how to get involved with the important work UN is doing. and do our part, because I feel like it's like each one of us has to make changes in our lives. That's if everyone makes something.
Yeah, no, thank you guys all for having me. This is super cool that we have so many people on the line from different parts of the world. Congratulations. It's really amazing that you're also involved and engaged.
I lied. Sam Baker just sent a message into the group chat. So
Oh.
we'll have the last word. Sam, if you can ask your last question.
Well, I want to say thank you. Hopefully you all can hear me. And this question is really, one, thank you for doing this. This has been fantastic. And two, you're working at the highest levels at the United Nations. You're engaging, I'm sure, not only the Secretary General, but leaders across the UN system, global leaders. What are the character traits that stand out to you? When you look at these leaders who've been in, some of them have been in these roles for decades and worked their way up to these positions, what are those character traits that stand out to you that make really strong, effective leaders, not just kind of within the system, but actually able to drive smart policy forward and realize the 2030 agenda? I wanted to make sure to ask you that question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's two people that stand out to me as just throughout my work the past 5 years, two of my bosses who have been really, really amazing. And I think maybe just thinking about why they've been so successful would be good. One is the one I referenced at the beginning, Bob Orr. With him, I just feel like he is so brilliant in terms of being able to sort of look at where we need to go in the future. Like, he's the one where, from what I understand, when Kofi Annan was still here, or when Ban Ki-moon just started, he was the one who said, climate needs to be your priority. This is going to be the issue. And this is back when nobody was really talking about climate change. Al Gore probably just started kind of talking about climate, and everyone's like, oh, it was just so, we weren't really seeing the impacts as much. But he had the vision to, be able to say, no, this is going to be the issue, and you should really get out ahead on it and make that your legacy. And I don't really know what the trait is other than, he's super brilliant. And I think he also surrounds himself with really good people and trusts people. Which also leads me to say that I think individuals within the system here who build good teams and are willing to empower the people that work for them, and not those two people, him and Christiana Figueres is the second one that I was going to say, are two people who, they find the right people and then they don't micromanage them. They, really trust their staff, and they empower them, and they take on advice. And so they're able to be better leaders, even if they're older, they're still very with the times and in tune. For example, I would say both those people are super in tune with the youth activist movement on climate, because they have an open mind about these things. I think a lot of the career diplomat types or the career UN types who just want a 9-to-5 job are not the ones who are going to be driving the really innovative stuff. You need to be really tireless. You need to have an open mind, and you need to listen to the best and brightest that you can find. And I also think being humble in these settings is really, really important, and not getting caught up in the ego of whatever your position or title is.
Thank you so much, Yassamin, for this amazing talk. And thank you also to all of the fellows.
Before we officially wrap up, and thanks, Sam, for the amazing question, the fellows, I'm sure, would love to keep in touch with you, Yassamin. What would be the best way to do so?
My Gmail, my personal Gmail would be the best way. So it's just my first and last name at Gmail. I'll type it in here.
Great. Typing it in the chat box. Yeah, thank you again so much for taking the time. I'm sure everyone here on this webinar learned a lot from this. And I hope everyone else, the fellows, hopefully were able to gain a lot of great insights. And we look forward to seeing you all sort of on Monday, the 25th, with Mrs. Zoe Dean Smith from Vital Voices. You can sign up for that webinar on Crew at millenniumfellows.org. So thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and it's a wrap.
Bye. Thank you.